This is an especially sensitive issue because just like Miss May said a second ago, there's real humans and their real lives, and they have real families with real problems. And on the other side of it, you have the rule of law and safety and a nation with borders. And so what progressivism does is it does an absolute excellent job at saying that those two things cannot coexist. You can't have compassion and you can't have law. You can't have order and you can't have mercy. Like borders and immigration and love do not go hand in hand in the progressive worldview. And so the plan for tonight is we're going to look at what's happening in the United States, and then we're going to go into the scriptures. You might notice that I joked with Faith that I put the entire Bible on our page tonight. Put a whole bunch of verses on there, but I figured that was a good use of space, and that's because we're actually going to look at God's design for nations and borders. And then hopefully we're going to come out of the other side of this with a framework to help us think about immigration biblically today. And so first thing that you'll see is just numbers. We have to see what's happening in our country. So as of 2024, the estimated number of illegal immigrants in the United States is somewhere between 11 and 22 million people. And that is a gigantic range. That's a range of 11 million people. And even the range of that number says something in and of itself. The government does not have a firm grasp about how many illegal immigrants are in the United States. In 2023, the Customs and Border Protection, CBP, recorded in 2023, 1 year, 2.4 million encounters at the southern border. Meaning this was the amount of people that attempted to cross into the nation. 2.4 million people in just 1 year. And so if you expand this number for decades, or even just for a number of years where, as Ms. Darlene said, the border was essentially open, you can see why we don't know what that number is. But somewhere between 11 and 22 million people in this country illegally. Between 2021 and 2024, there were over 7 million encounters at the southern border. So that is a historic high across the entire nation's history, which tells us why this is such a highly debated topic today. Here's the interesting thing. The United States issues about 1 million green cards every single year and has so just thinking about that, 1 million green cards, meaning for people that are wanting to come to this country legally, they're allowing about 1 million people in every year. So this is an interesting number. 46 million people in the United States were not born in the United States. So 14% of the US population was not born here, which leads to that next fill in the blank. The United States is the most welcoming nation for legal immigration in the world. This is not something that you will ever see on the news. The United States is kind of by far the most welcoming nation for legal immigration in the world. This is not a country that hates immigrants. The question is not about whether the United States values immigrants. That is a whole lot of immigrants. The question is whether the nation's laws will be enforced. So here's why Christians often get tripped up by this. We know that we are supposed to be caring and merciful and compassionate and kind. And people think that, yes, that is a biblical and a good thing. But I don't know if you remember from a few weeks ago, I talked about the Mott and Bailey approach. And the Mott and Bailey was essentially like a bait and switch. And so you'll hear something like, you should care about suffering, you should care about people. And absolutely, that is true. We should care about suffering and we should care about people. But then the Bailey part of that is taking that to an extent. Because you are loving and kind, then therefore that means you should be enforcing or allowing of illegal immigration. And if you don't do that, then you're not kind and you're not compassionate. So it's essentially manipulation. Well-meaning Christians constantly fall into the category of thinking that you can either be compassionate or you can either love justice, but you can't have both, which leads to that next fill in the blank. Oh, wait, I think it is a fill in the blank. Let's see, where's Balin? Balin, can you give me a paper so I can make sure? I have a whole bunch of notes and I don't remember the blanks I gave you guys. But If it is a fill in the blank, here's what it was. You can love immigrants and believe in the rule of law. That's not a fill in the blank. Thank you. Yes. It is, those two things are not opposed to each other. Oh yeah, it is. Scripturally, you can both love immigrants and believe in the rule of law. Sorry about that, y'all. I'm sorry? You can love immigrants and believe in the rule of law. Rule of law. Yes. You can have compassion for somebody that is trying to get across the border, who is coming from a very difficult situation, and you can also believe that open borders are dangerous and contrary to God's design. Those two things are not contradictions, although progressives will often make them out to be. So what does God's word actually say? That next fill in the blank. God is the author of nations and borders. And this is where we're going to get into a whole bunch of Bible.
Nations and what?
Borders. God is the author of nations and borders. So where do we even see these things coming from in the Bible? So after the flood in Genesis chapter 10, God's plan for humanity is very much about nations. So in Genesis chapter 10, verse 1, we read, "These are the generations of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Sons were born to them after the flood." Then just a few verses later in verse 5, "From these the coastland peoples spread in their lands, each with his own language, by their clans in their nations." Then we go down to verse 32. "These are the clans of the son of Noah according to their genealogies in their nations, and from these the nations spread abroad on the earth after the flood." So there we see distinct peoples, distinct languages, distinct territories. Everyone is claiming their piece of land. Then in Genesis chapter 11, the people of Babel really try to erase all of that. From chapters 10 to 11, a whole bunch of stuff happens. The people of Babel want to build a centralized empire. They want to erase these distinctions between humanity. They were pretty crazy. They wanted to consolidate all of their human power and build a tower up to God. And God completely intervenes and he stops them. He confuses their language and scatters them across the earth. This is where we get to verse 1 of chapter 11. "Now the whole earth had one language and the same words." Verse 4, "Then they said, 'Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth.'" And so there's a whole bunch of theology that we can go into with that, but essentially they wanted to be great in their own eyes, make a name for themselves, and they were one people, one nation. Then in verses 5 through 9, we see God intervening. "And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the children of man had built. And the Lord said, 'Behold, they are one people, and they have all one language. And this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing that they have proposed to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down there and confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another's speech.' So the Lord dispersed them from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore its name was called Babel, because the Lord confused the language of all the earth. And from there the Lord dispersed them over the face of all the earth." So I actually think that this idea of Babel is something that a lot of progressives would aim for. It's a global, centralized empire that sounds very, very utopian. It's no borders whatsoever. Everyone all together, everyone trying to work together. But then God determined that it would create all sorts of problems for society, that it was not going to be good for them. It was definitely not going to be good for their relationship with God. So a lot of times we see the scattering and the confusion that God put on them as a punishment, which it likely was, but it was also an act of mercy. It was mercy that God was protecting humanity from themselves and protecting them from sliding even more into corruption. So God gave them distinct languages. He spread them out with borders and different cultures so that they would not slide further into corruption. And then in the New Testament, Paul says this even more explicitly in Acts chapter 17. And he made from one man every nation to mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place. God determined the boundaries of nations, and that was intentional. If you go through the Old Testament, what you're going to see is you're going to see God specifically saying how much land each of the tribes of Israel should have. God is not opposed to borders. Whenever we read the entire book of Nehemiah, Nehemiah is about building a wall to protect its own city, to protect the citizens. And so God is not against borders. He is not against barriers. He's not against nations. It's part of God's design for how humanity should be governed. So why am I saying all of this? That means that when someone argues for a borderless nation in the name of Christian love, they're not building on the scriptures. That idea is not coming from God. That idea is actually something that comes from Babel. They're arguing for something that God intentionally intervened in and something that God showed wasn't a good idea. And so just to show you the spiritual side of this, now we're going to see a really cool passage in the book of Acts. So in Babel, the entire world was essentially one big empire. God scatters the people, gives them different languages, and then we fast forward to Acts chapter 2. This is what happens at Pentecost. Now there were dwelling in Jerusalem Jews, devout men from every nation under heaven. And at this sound the multitude came together, and they were bewildered because each one was hearing them speak in his own language. And they were amazed and astonished, saying, "Are not all these who are speaking Galileans? And how is it that we hear, each of us in his own native language? Parthians and Medes and Elamites and residents of Mesopotamia and Judea and Cappadocia and Pontus and Asia and Phrygia and Pamphylia and Egypt and the parts of Libya belonging to Cyrene and visitors from Rome, both Jews and proselytes, Cretans and Arabians. We hear them telling in our own tongues the mighty works of God." And so at Pentecost, the gospel is going out and reaches people from all of these nations, from all those languages, tribes, and it unites them spiritually in Christ without erasing the nation that they came from. And so what we see here is almost a reverse of Babel in saying that, yes, God did confuse everyone's nations and he had them spread out. But here we see that under Christ, God is actually uniting a people for himself. And so even in Revelation, we see this. We see at the very end of time, people from every nation, tribe, tongue, people, language gathered around the throne of God, worshiping him. And so even thinking about that, if it's people from every nation, tribe, people, language, God never intends for borders to be erased. It's part of his very design. These distinctions are there will be there for all of eternity. And so now we've seen that nations and boundaries and borders are biblical, but now we'll see when those two things mix and when someone leaves their own nation to join another nation. And so the Bible uses two words for that word foreigner. The two passages that we're going to look at are verses that progressives love to quote, but we're going to see them in context. So before we get to them, this is probably the verse that you have heard, Leviticus 19. I didn't put this one on your paper. It says, "When a stranger sojourns with you in your land, you shall not do him wrong. You shall treat the stranger who sojourns with you as the native among you, and you shall love him as yourself." Isn't that amazing? So people will intentionally use that verse to say something that it actually doesn't mean. When a stranger sojourns with you in your land, you shall not do him wrong. You shall treat the stranger who sojourns with you as the native among you. Taking that at face value, that means that we should be completely fine with people coming across the border, and they should be completely treated as equals, whether they did it legally or illegally. Meaning, if anyone gets across the border, they should sort of be granted citizenship, all of the rights and benefits of citizenship, because we're supposed to treat them as the native among us. That is the progressive view. So when progressives quote Leviticus chapter 19, they're sort of assuming that this passage applies to everyone that's foreign. But that's not what the text actually says. There is a very clear distinction in two words that I want to talk about. The first one is the ger, and that means the legal resident. The legal resident. The legal resident. That's for that first fill in the blank. So you'll see it translated in Bibles as either sojourner or stranger or alien. And the ger was someone who left their own nation, they left their own homeland, and then they settled into Israel. But the very important distinction is that they settled in Israel with the permission of Israel. They had complete permission from the nation to be there. So they made a commitment to keep the laws and the customs and the culture of the nation of Israel. So in modern terms, they were legal immigrants, but they were residents of that nation. The important thing that I really want to emphasize for this is that they would submit to Israel's laws and customs. They would commit to living under the same order and the same rule as everyone else. And so because of that, the ger, the one that was a legal resident of that nation, they had all of the rights and privileges of the citizen of that nation. They were granted economic boosts. They were protected from being exploited. God commanded Israel literally to love them as themselves. And so you see even God's heart for them. But here's another verse that shows almost on the exact same thing. It says, Numbers chapter 15, "One law and one rule shall be for you and for the stranger who sojourns with you." So, one law. They weren't supposed to be treated as second-class citizens. They weren't supposed to be looked down on or mistreated. For the sojourner, for the ger, the legal residents, they were supposed to be seen as completely equal as everyone else. Now, that's in contrast to the second word, which is the zar, which means the unauthorized foreigner. So this word literally means outsider, and it refers to foreigners who didn't have legal access in their land. These were people that were passing through the nation without formal permission from Israel. They might have been living there, but they were living there without permission. They never agreed to live under Israel's laws and customs. They were unauthorized. So the zar was still supposed to be treated with basic human decency as an image bearer of God, but specific legal rights and these privileges and the benefits that the ger were getting were not given to the zar. And you can see this in Deuteronomy chapter 15. "You may collect something from a foreigner, but you must forgive whatever your brother owes you." And so this is in the context of being able to collect interest on debts that were owed. What he was saying is you can collect interest from foreigners, from the czars that are living among us that were never put there, but you must forgive whatever your brother owes you. And so whenever we read the words or hear the words from progressives, you're called to love the sojourner in the Bible. You're called to love them just as you love yourself. Then we have to ask, which one are they talking about? Is it the ger or is it the zar? Is it the one that is living among us equally and legally, or is it the one that's living among us illegally? And so that next fill in the blank is a picture that you would all remember, and I would say that Ruth is the perfect picture of what this should look like. Ruth is the perfect picture of this. Do you remember what nation Ruth came from? Moab. She was absolutely a foreigner. She wasn't from Israel. She had every reason to go back to her own people, her own land. But that's not what she did. In Ruth chapter 1, verse 16, it says this: "Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God." So that's an example of the ger. That's lawful immigration. She decided to submit herself to Israel, to the people, the laws. Even Israel's God became her God. And because of that, she received all of the full rights, privileges, protections, the blessings of the community. And Boaz showed her honor, and she ended up being a part of the lineage of Jesus. And so that's what happens when a foreigner comes into a nation and submits themselves to the laws of that nation. It's an incredible example. But the counterpart of that is the czar. So you can see the difference. All people, of course, are worthy of dignity, value, and respect. This is not a question of that, but the Bible makes a strong distinction between a person who is living among the people and entering a nation the right way and the wrong way. So we should have those two categories in our minds when we're talking about immigration. But now, how does the government relate to all of this? Romans, before I do the next fill in the blank, Romans chapter 13, you might remember from our study on government a few weeks ago. It says, "For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval, for he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out wrath on the wrongdoer." So that next fill in the blank, the government's role is justice. Justice. The government's job is not mercy or charity, it is justice. Remember, the government bears the sword. Its job is to reward good and punish evil. And so when someone does wrong, the government's job is not to turn the other cheek. That's the job of the Christian individual. The Christian is called to turn the other cheek, but the government deals in consequences for breaking the law, and their job is to uphold order in a society in order to protect its own citizens. So what does that mean for the government and immigration? The next fill in the blank. Enforcing immigration law is fulfillment of Romans chapter 13. Fulfillment of Romans chapter 13. So a government that doesn't, doesn't enforce its own laws against unlawful entry is, in an attempt at being compassionate, is actually failing at the God-given role that the government should have. So you might remember the illustration that I gave a couple of weeks ago. If the government were to say bank robbery is illegal, but there's absolutely no consequences for you to rob a bank. You shouldn't do it, it's bad, but there's not going to be any consequences for it. Then everyone is just going to go and rob the bank. Justice requires consequences, and it's the same thing with immigration. If the government has made it illegal to enter the United States, apart from the appropriate methods, then the last thing the government should do is reward that behavior. When you reward lawlessness, you're going to get lawlessness. When you reward chaos, you're going to get chaos. Now, a distinction is the government is not the church, which is the next fill in the blank. The government is not the church. We have to remember that the government and the church have completely different callings. The church's job is to preach the gospel to all of creation. It doesn't matter if the person is an immigrant, a resident, a citizen. It does not matter. We don't need to check immigration status before we preach the gospel to someone. We don't have to know whether they're here legally or illegally before we give them food or water or shelter. But that is the job of the individual. That's what individual people or groups of people can do. And that's because all people are made in the image of God. And so we care and we love for all people. But this is where the line is drawn. Ministering to someone is not the same as saying that the law doesn't apply to them. A church can absolutely feed a family, pray with them, share the gospel with them, and yet at the same time still acknowledge that the government has a responsibility to enforce the law. And so these two things are not opposed to each other. We can say repent and believe in Jesus Christ for the forgiveness of your sins while also saying you have done something illegal. Those two things are not opposed to each other. And what the church can't do, and what crosses a very biblical line, is actively work against the government's job. And what I mean by that is, just as we talked about a moment ago, there's actually Christians that set up sanctuary cities for illegal immigrants. And they say, we're going to lock you in and we're not going to let the government do their job. We're going to protect you and we're going to keep you away. That is definitely a misappropriation of between the government's job and the Christian's job. So Christians shouldn't advocate for lawlessness. They shouldn't work against the laws of the land. And at the same time, it's 100% fine for individual Christians to do acts of mercy and good works towards illegal immigrants in the United States. But it's not the government's job. The government's job is to serve its own people first, which is where we're going to get to this next part. There's one thing that a lot of people have forgotten, and that's that the government of a nation has a duty and obligation to its own citizens first. And so each and every nation's government has a responsibility to its own citizens. Its job is to protect the people within its own borders. And that sounds mean, but there's actual biblical precedent for this. It started, this phrase was on the news a while back because Vice President J.D. Vance talked about it, and it's called the Ordo Amoris. The Ordo Amoris. Now, if you Google that term, a whole bunch of Catholic stuff is going to pop up. And so don't send me an email saying that I'm trying to make the church Catholic. I promise you I'm not. But the principle is, I believe, valid, and this is what it teaches. The Ordo Mortis is the order of love. It means we have a greater responsibility to physically care for those closest to us. We have a greater responsibility to physically care for those closest to us. And so the basic principle is that our obligations are sort of supposed to flow outward in concentric circles. So the first love that we have is to love the Lord our God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength. And then we love our family. The responsibility that we have is to our family first. And then it flows outward to our church. And we have a greater responsibility to care for those in our church. And then we expand that to our community. And then from our community to our state, and then from our state to our nation, and then from our nation to the world. And so it's prioritizing your first and foremost duty, and then flowing outward from there. And the biblical precedent for this, 1 Timothy chapter 5. But if anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for members of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. This is saying that Christians have a massive responsibility for their own families and their own homes. If a father takes the food off of his child's plates in order to feed a stranger across the city, that is definitely not good, or it's not noble, it's evil. It's a distortion of the responsibilities that we have. And then Galatians chapter 6. So then, as we have opportunity, let us do good to everyone, and especially to those who are of the household of faith. So that word especially carries a lot of weight. It's not saying that it's bad to do good to absolutely everyone, but we have a special obligation to the other Christians around us. Again, it's that concentric circle that we were talking about. And the same principle applies to our government. A government that sacrifices the safety or the well-being or the wages or the general welfare of its own citizens at the expense of people that are not citizens of that nation is not doing good. They're the same thing as taking food off of your child's plate to give it to a stranger. The government is not called to care for the entire world first. It is called to care for its own citizens first. Another part of this is the government is, and I didn't put this as a fill in the blank, but the government is not under an obligation to accept immigrants into its own nation. Meaning the United States has no biblical obligation to welcome a certain number of immigrants into the country. So this is another part that we really have to think biblically about, because we shouldn't necessarily be anti-immigration. But when we think about the role of government, I don't think that the primary role of the government is to allow a certain number of immigrants into the country. The Bible doesn't command that. And if you remember in Ruth, she said, "Your people will be my people." The immigrants that we talked about earlier meant that they were going to submit to the customs and the laws of that nation. That means that they were going to place themselves under the authority of the governments in that nation. But, and this is the part that we really have to think about, what happens when those two things are incompatible? When somebody is taking the legal measures to come into the United States, but they are not compatible with the United States way of life. And here's what I mean. Imagine someone grows up in a nation where they are known for chanting the words "Death to America." And they got a tattoo on their arm that says "Death to America." and they are wearing a shirt to their immigration interview that says "Death to America," is the government under an obligation to allow that person into the country? Even if they go about it the right way, even if they fill out all the paperwork, pay all of the fines, this does not mean that the government has to allow them into the country. Why? Because its primary duty is the protection of its own citizens, of its own people. The primary role of the government to punish evil and reward good, to protect its own nation. And so the government is not called to just be an open door. It is also not under a biblical obligation to allow just anyone into the nation, but its primary duty is to protect its own citizens. And now we're going to talk about various arguments which constantly are used against Christians to promote illegal immigration. And so the first one is Jesus was an illegal immigrant. That might feel weird filling in the blank. I probably should have phrased that a different way. Jesus was not an illegal immigrant, y'all. But this is an argument that people use to weaponize against Christians. They say Jesus was an illegal immigrant. So the claim is that when Joseph and Mary and Jesus fled to Egypt in order to escape Herod's persecution, that they were illegal immigrants. So people say that any Christian who supports borders or who supports boundaries is essentially saying that they would be willing to deport Jesus if he was knocking on our door. Absolutely ridiculous. So here's the counter, and I left a little bit of space if you wanted to take notes. When Joseph, Mary, and Jesus were traveling to Egypt, both Judea and Egypt were part of the entirety of the Roman Empire. So they were moving within the exact same jurisdiction under the exact same authority. They were not traveling internationally. There weren't immigration laws that were prohibiting this. They were just looking for safety within the boundaries of the empire that they already lived in. So Jesus was not an illegal immigrant by any means.
Judea and what was the other state?
Egypt. Yeah. Yeah, they were fleeing to Egypt. The next one is, aren't you supposed to be like the Good Samaritan? Aren't you supposed to be like the Good Samaritan? So the parable of the Good Samaritan is the other passage that people will love to bring up. And if you remember, the Good Samaritan saw a man bleeding in a ditch. He stopped to help him. He bound up his wounds. He put him on his donkey. He took him to an inn. He paid for the care of this man. He didn't ask for this man's papers or immigration status. He didn't ask what nation he was from. He saw a human that was there, made in the image of God, suffering, and he decided to show mercy. And that is definitely a good thing for Christians to do. But whenever progressives argue for this, they try to use it to drive our national immigration policy, which is where this all breaks down. This is not a passage about our border policy. It's not a passage about the governments. It's a passage about individuals loving and caring for others. So if you think about it like this, there's 8 billion people in the world, and hundreds of millions of them living in poverty or in violence or in some sort of circumstance that's bad. And so if the Good Samaritan parable means that the United States is just supposed to accept everyone who wants to come without limits, without process, without any enforcement, then that's actually arguing for a complete and total collapse of our society. If you think about it like this, if a lifeboat that can only hold 10 people is put into water with 1,000 people in it, and everyone tries to jump onto that lifeboat, it's going to sink. And it's the same thing with our government. If the government tries to adopt the attitude of compassion and mercy instead of justice, it's actually going to make the lifeboat that we're in sink. And so the Good Samaritan is a great parable, but it's about individual responsibilities and individual love and not the role of the government. And then the last one that I didn't put as a fill in the blank, but we already talked about it, is the Bible says to welcome the stranger. So when someone says in Leviticus 19, love the sojourner as yourself, the first thing that you need to ask yourself is which sojourner? Is it the ger or is it the czar? The czar, the person who has not come through the legal means, has not submit to our nation's governments. They absolutely still bear the image of God, and they should be treated with basic dignity, but the Bible doesn't say that they're automatically given the rights of citizens of that country. And not only that, you might remember that a couple of weeks ago I talked about the government being fair and the government being just. It doesn't matter whether you're rich or whether you're poor. It doesn't matter what family you come from. Justice means that the same law applies to absolutely everyone. But what does it say to the people who did absolutely everything right, who waited for years, who filled out the paperwork, who paid the fees, who went through the entire process? What does that say when the government just waves people through the border for people who didn't do all of that? That is not justice, that's not fairness, that's not using equal weights or measures. That's an imbalance and that's an injustice. And so one of the things that we've even seen on the news is Christian pastors or churches saying things like, if you support borders, if you support ICE, then you really are not loving your neighbor. And that I know that they're trying to sound compassionate. I know that they're trying to sound the most loving as they can, but it is an injustice. It is not good. At the very, very end of this, we see two things. Justice and compassion are not opposed to each other. Justice and compassion are not opposed to each other. Micah chapter 6 says, "He has told you, O man, what is good and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God." So those two things do not go against each other. Justice and kindness can absolutely coexist. But one of the things that I do want to let you know is that that is not popular. You might have seen on the news that in Minnesota back in January, and this is what's amazing, a Southern Baptist church was completely raided by protesters in the middle of one of their services. And the reason they were raided is because one of the elders of that church worked as a director in the ICE office in Minneapolis. And so this man who is, I'm sure, a godly Christian man because he's an elder of a Southern Baptist church, is simply doing his job of trying to keep the government running, trying to uphold justice, and yet people hated him for it. And didn't just hate him for it, they raided his own church, scaring children, scaring women. And so I'm well aware that this is not a popular thing. And I'm even putting this teaching up on YouTube, so hopefully everything goes well for us. But this kind of animosity that people have towards the government simply doing their job, we have to remember that it's not just a political issue, but that it's ultimately a spiritual issue. It's rebellion against God, rebellion against authority. It's people that love the darkness rather than the light. And so in all of these things, we have to remember that the preaching of the gospel is the first and foremost thing. It doesn't matter whether it's the ger or the czar. It doesn't matter whether you're here legally or illegally. It doesn't matter whether you're citizens or not citizens. The preaching of the gospel has to be first and foremost, and we have to do it with courage, knowing that this teaching isn't popular by any means.